our final assignment for CDC301, and the last assignment that we're going to do in class, is an Alla Prima portrait. Now, we've had 9 weeks up to this point to become comfortable with the box scheme shadow mapping of a model while working with the model, getting the model back into pose, using our nose monitor and checking the shadow under the nose. So we should be familiar with the process. Even process working on toned paper should become pretty familiar to us now. We've done all of our Vanderpoels and all of our Bridgmans. We've done everything, so hopefully we've practiced it so much that we have a pretty firm understanding of how everything should work and how we should approach everything. So we have to do it all in one night. Now, one sitting. And there's a couple of ways to do this, and you're open to an approach, whatever approach you might want to have. You may just want to stick to the approach we've been working on thus far, as long as you can accurately get through a shadow map in the first couple sittings. I mean, you need to be able to execute an Alla Prima portrait, you need to be able to hit a shadow map in the first 40 minutes to an hour if we're going to be doing this in 3 hours. The other option is to work sort of shape to shape. This is a Richard Schmidt idea. This is how I actually learned how to paint, was to just set the boundaries for the model on the page. In this case, it would be kind of like a box with a head, but just tick mark for the left, tick mark for the right, tick mark for the top, and tick mark for the bottom. And then figure out where the eye shape is going to be in there. The eye socket shape is going to be within that, and starts to map that out and figure that out, and then build all of the other shapes on top of that. And actually, in doing so, not just execute a whole shadow map, but completely render out one eye. So you start with the no-tan shape for an eye, for example, and then in that same sitting, that first sitting, you actually start flushing out the eye and completely render the eye. So it'd be like after you hit your first sort of preliminary box of where the head's supposed to be on the page, then you jump right in to kind of a Vanderpoel eye in the first sitting, and then in all the subsequent sittings we measure everything off of that first eye. So we don't really use the box to measure off of, we use that first eye to measure off of, and hopefully we've placed it well enough within the box that there's not too much growth or reduction as we continue through the portrait. And if there is, usually it's not a huge deal as long as we've given ourselves enough room all the way around. So that's one method. You get that eye fleshed out in the first 20-minute sitting, and then the next 20-minute sitting you're doing the other eye, the next 20-minute sitting you're doing the nose, and the next you're doing the mouth, and then you do the chin and forehead and hair and ears, and it just sort of blossoms out from the center. That might work for you. You just have to have a lot of control, because each shape that you render, you have to not only compare the location and the size, but also the values and the edges to this first initial shape that you've laid down. And if you're not always, consistently, frequently, every thought or every decision you make, if it's not compared back to that first shape you put down, then it's going to spiral out of control. You can't just compare it to the model. You have to compare it to your actual drawing too. You have to compare the new shape on the model to the original one you did, and then go to your drawing, the new shape on your drawing to the original shape you did, every single time. If the model moves, or if you're dealing with a model that tends to move a little more frequently, then it is not an ideal method to work with until you become really familiar with anatomy and how to adjust and compensate for that. And this is something I had to learn the hard way at the palette and chisel too, because before I had learned about anatomy and I was completely observational, and I worked in this method of working shape to shape, the model would often shift their head up or down or left or right, so the perspective and the placements that I had in the mouth often didn't line up with the perspective and placements of the eyes that I had. So I learned that I had a limited amount of time to get this all figured out, and that I always had to marriage my drawing and the shapes within my drawing to the relative positions on the model. So if the model had ended up tilting their head and everything's at a slant now, I had to compensate for that and straighten it back out on my drawing. So it becomes a little tricky to deal with that. And again, the other method is to box, scheme, shadow map the whole thing, and then start to build the drawing on top of that. That tends to work really, really well, because then if the model tilts or moves at all, you just don't change your initial shadow map. If it's accurate, you leave it. And so you just sort of marriage the values that you see up on the model to the shapes you've located and measured out on your drawing. And it's a little less to have to adjust or fix. So this is an Alla Prima demonstration that I did in one of the previous classes of our model Vanessa here. The process used is just it wasn't a shape to shape, it was the boxing and scheming and shadow mapping of everything and then fleshing it out from there. Now, what separates this from one of the drawings that we looked at before, the 3-week drawing that I showed you guys or the 4-week drawing that I showed you guys? It's not accuracy, it's just level of refinement. And this is an important thing to consider. Just because something is alla prima, or direct, or loose, does not mean it's inaccurate. A drawing that's done in 3 hours must exhibit the same amount of accuracy as a drawing done in 12 hours or 20 hours. The only difference should be the amount of refinement that's put into the drawing on top of that accurate structure. So this is refined enough for us to see that it has a likeness of the model, that there's 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, and there's a few highlights in there, and some edges to indicate the type of lighting condition that's on there. But if we look closely at this, there's no details of the face in here. There's no superficial details on the model. And it's almost reads as a impressionistic drawing. There's not a whole lot of time in this drawing to be following the form a lot and enhancing the idea of form. You're just sort of getting this impressionistic view of the lighting pattern on there. And if you get that impressionistic view correctly, it will look like the model. And then this could be a basis, if I want, to carry it out and get in here and fill in all the little irregularities within there and build on top of it and make it look more solid and structural and tighter, if you will. But it's not necessary in some cases. And in fact, it's often a good idea to know which situations it's all right to leave it a little looser and just sort of implied versus where you have to go in and really tighten it up and really flesh it out. In most cases, we might consider the size of the painting to be a factor. If it's a large painting that's intended to be hung up on the wall or high away, then there's no need to put a lot of information, a lot of the tiny little details in there. For example, this very drawing is normally hung way at the top of our ceilings here. We have 14, 15-foot ceilings here, and this drawing is hung at the top, right underneath the ceiling. So from that distance, any amount of specific, subtle rendering that I would put into that drawing would be completely lost. We wouldn't be able to see it from down here on the floor. So it ends up being a waste of time, or an ineffective use of time to flesh all that detail out. And where would you notice this? Well, go to museums, look at large paintings, and try to get as close as you can to a large painting that was originally intended to be hung high on the wall. You'll notice that the faces are rendered out very simply. Especially if the face is a smaller head within a large painting, it's going to be rendered out even less, to the point where it's barely pushed past the initial notan stage. There's just a little bit more information than that. So it's important to know that you don't have to get a super polished, refined drawing every time. And in fact, that super polished, refined drawing has no bearing whatsoever on whether you achieved a correct and believable drawing. So the final portraits that you guys are working on at home, it could be an alla prima portrait. It doesn't necessarily need to exhibit all of the detail and all of the information in a really tightly refined classical drawing. It could be a looser and more suggestive. The accuracy lies whether or not you got the correct shape, value, and edge and placement of all those things. And if you did, and of all the broader strokes in something like this drawing, then it will be enough to be a successful portrait. But if you focus on the detail, excuse me, the noodling, which students so often do, starting right in with the nostrils is what they always seem to do, or the pupils of the eyes all the time. Starting something like a drawing like that and focusing on those details can cause you to miss the overall big relationships of light and dark and the placement of shapes. So you'll notice even Even a drawing like this, the eyes aren't very refined. So even if I had started with one shape, if I had started with the eye and let it blossom out from there, I would still have to know that this is the maximum level of rendering that I would do before moving on. Keep that in mind as you go forward. Do not focus on the little noodling ideas. The important element is to have the big overall shapes correct in the right relationship to each other, with the correct values relationship and the correct edge relationship. All right, let's see what you can do.